I'm really excited to be here tonight, and I want to welcome you all to our second and final reading of the Lindenwood University MFA program's Fall 2021 Writing Series. Tonight, we have Maggie Stiefvater joining us. Maggie has published over 15 books. Several of those have been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Maggie claims to always have known that she wanted to write popular fiction, which she describes as the kind of book where the author's name is larger than the title, and you can pick it up anywhere books are sold. If you somehow manage to miss her name before, keep your eyes open and you'll quickly learn that she has succeeded at this goal. Her latest series is the Dreamer Trilogy. In it, Ronan Lynch can pull curiosities and catastrophes out of his dreams. The second volume of this series, Mr. Impossible, was released in May of this year. Wildly adept at entering the minds of more than one character and building worlds that are both real and beyond our wildest dreams, Stiefvater is a writer for all of us to learn from, regardless of our varied writing goals. She can be found at her home when she's not writing, she can be found at her home in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, making art, playing instruments, including the bagpipes, and hanging out with her kids, husband, and goats, or riding around in her Camaro named Loki. I'm thrilled that Zoom allows us to join together tonight. Welcome to Lindenwood, Maggie.
Thank you. All right, guys. I know that you are from all kinds of writing backgrounds. Can you guys hear me as well? Nod, yes. Okay, good. I know you guys are from all different kinds of backgrounds, and I know that you have all sorts of different goals for your MFAs. And so I'm going to talk specifically to my experience, but if you guys have any other questions that you feel like I can answer about what your goals are, please send them in the chat. You already heard from Shana that I am a New York Times bestselling novelist for fiction, but I have known ever since I was small that I wanted to make my living writing, just storytelling in all different formats. So I've not only written novels, I've published short stories, I've published novellas, I've written feature automotive pieces for Road and Track. I have written speeches. I've done writing in all different formats, fiction and nonfiction, and I hope that I can just keep on pushing into other forms of writing. I just think it's such an interesting time that we're living in now, more than ever, even though there are more writers than ever. There's more kinds of media for us to push into, with podcasts, with digital writing, with stuff that you can do, still print that you can hold in your hand. And now self-publishing has become a thing where now it's actually respected as opposed to being looked down on. So there's so many different ways to get our voices out there. So yeah, I'm just excited to do that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've done with my career. And then I have some questions already, but if you guys have questions that you want to throw in before that, feel free to. Okay, it's always strange to do a Zoom call. I'm used to doing things on a stage. So when did I start writing? Started writing when I was a tiny thing. I liked the way that you said, I claim to have always wanted to write. It's true, right? We're all fallible narrators, yes. So when I was a kid, a scrawny little awkward kid, I still remember tapping away at my father's word processor, which should tell you how old the story is, because some of you will probably know that a word processor was a portable computer about the size of my desk, right? But you just need to imagine it. It's enormous, right? Very low functionality. And so I was tapping away at this thing, working on my novel. And I remember that my father, an emergency room doctor, came up to me and he said, "So Maggie, what are you doing?" And I said, I'm writing a novel. And he said, "Well, is that what you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "Yes, I want to be a writer." And he said, "Oh, you want to be poor?" Now, in his defense, I remember the novel I was working on very clearly. It was about 2 dogs test driving a car. So that should tell you both my level of writing ability and also my age that I was when I was writing this novel. But I always knew, like I said, that I wanted to write, and not just write, but most importantly, I knew I wanted to write for other people. And that's the reason why I said at the beginning of this that everybody comes to an MFA for a different reason. My father, the emergency room doctor, actually also got his MFA because he had a dream of writing a novel. And it's not that he wanted anyone else to see the novel. He wanted the skills to be able to actually just put his hands on literature. And everyone in my family, if they appreciate a thing, they kind of want to know how to do it too. So if you love to listen to a kind of music, then they would also learn to play that music. So for him, it was like this natural extension of loving literature, was learning how the sausage was made, basically. So for me, my version of my MFA was, when I was a kid, I knew I wanted to learn how to write for other people, because the big thing is that you never come out of the faucet knowing how to write for other people, because you are never other people. It's like learning to speak. I once heard a TED talk that's from a speech coach, and he was talking about how people often hate the way their voices sound, which is true. I hate the way my voice sounds. Many people, when you hear your voice on your answering machine or whatever, you hate the way your voice sounds. And he was saying that it was his job to teach people how to speak in such a way that they liked the way that their voice sounded to other people. And one of the big hurdles that he had to overcome was that people thought that it was artificial to change the way they spoke, to learn as an adult to get speaking lessons. And he said, isn't this bizarre though? Because why do we speak? The only reason why you would ever say anything out loud is for other people, right? If you have a thought and no one else needs to have it translated, you've already gotten it. It's in its perfect form. So that's stuck with me so much, because writing for other people is a different thing than writing for yourself. If you're writing for yourself, it only ever has to do what you want it to do. And that's still a valid practice. But if you want to write commercially, which is what I do, you have to learn how it lands in other people's hearts, which means you learn all of the different tricks and tips that you would as a literary writer about figurative speech and metaphor, but you're using them to trick other people. You're getting into their subconscious and moving the furniture around in their head, because instead of going and saying, the character was really angry and now you feel angry as well. Instead, even the pulpiest commercial writing, if it's skilled, secretly gets in there and uses all of those tricks that we've learned from more elaborate and award-winning prose, that figurative language, the metaphors, to get in there so that readers don't exactly understand how they arrive at the idea that they're upset, but you have done the work for them. Commercial writing is basically that. You are doing all of the heavy lifting for the reader, so the reader doesn't have to put any work in. When I was a kid, when I said that I wanted to write those genres that have the names bigger, my name bigger than the title, the thing that defines those books is that they're page turners, right? Everyone always talks about how you just go in and the pages just fell away. So learning to do that work for the reader basically took up most of my teen years. This is a very long way of saying that by the time that I hit college, I had written over 30 novels, and don't worry, most of them were terrible. But I was learning that concept of constantly throwing books at my various family members and my friends. And when they would come back to me and say, I stopped at this part, or this part's boring, or I hate this character, instead of ever getting upset by that feedback, it's not about me. When you're writing for someone else, the feedback is, did I make them feel the way I wanted to make them feel, which isn't about your skill, it's about your skill in translation. So instead of ever getting upset about critique, instead I became hungry for critique, because the only way I, as a very awkward child, could learn about other people's feedback was other people, just more and more and more. So I constantly surrounded myself with writing groups, with beta readers, and honestly, gosh, by the time I hit my 20s, I knew that I was plateauing. I knew my prose was pretty nice. I knew that my stories were interesting. I knew I would never have a problem coming up with ideas. But I also just knew that I wasn't really getting anywhere as far as my queries were coming back unanswered, or they were coming back with, dear author, thank you for writing, but stop. Regards, editor. Or I was getting feedback from my writing group members that would say, this is fine, this is good, just query it. But nobody was in love with it. The point was, you've got to be in love with it. Otherwise, you're just being a workman, sort of. Anybody can learn to write just really efficient prose, and that's what I had done. But I still wasn't really making that final gap of just learning how to write for other people emotionally. And for me, specifically, I'm sure it's because I was young emotionally as well. I was in my college years. I was a very emotionally awkward, stilted person. And I went to college, I started a band, and I became a history major. I didn't write fiction for years and years. And all I learned to do was write the driest subjects, history papers for other people. And that actually turned out to be the thing that I needed to learn how to write emotion. Instead of cheating by writing a very emotional topic badly and failing to connect, instead, I had to take something that was nothing inherently emotional about it at all. It was so taken away from the actual humanity of the situation, and instead find a way to inject feeling into it so that people were not bored senseless by a 20-page paper on, ancient 14th century Scottish history. And learning that actually made me come back to my fiction with brand new eyes, because I thought, oh, if I could do that with every single line in between the emotional bits, I'll bet I've done my groundwork then. So that was really my breakthrough. Do I want to tell my quick publication story? I think I will, and then I'll open up for questions. The quick publication story was not a quick publication story. What I did was I wrote a retelling of a old Celtic fairy tale. It's a 90,000 word novel written in third person. And my first beta reader said it sounded like it had been written by a dead old guy from the 1880s. Fair. So I revised it a couple of times and I sent it in to a small publisher, and the small publisher did an amazing thing. This editor, Andrew Carr, sent me back an email and he said, look, do you think you would be willing to edit this for me so I could take it to acquisitions? I don't want to take it to them like this because they're not going to want it, but I really think that there's something there. Could you edit it for me? So he gave me a couple of suggestions about making it tighter, about focusing the plot a little bit. So I dove into it, edited it, sent it back to him. He went off to acquisitions and he came back and he said, I'm sorry, bad news. Acquisition says that you're not ready, but you know what? Please send me whatever you write next. And this was like my first piece of really huge feedback that felt amazing. It felt amazing because I didn't hear them no. What I heard was, can I see what you write next? And I mean, okay, yes, because I know I'm going to keep on writing. So then I kept on writing. I wrote another novel, a completely different one. And I sent that to him. And he emailed back and he said, this is going to sound ridiculous, but I can't stop thinking about the setup of your first novel. Do you think that, I know it's been a year and a half, but do you think if I gave you edits for it again, now that I'm a better editor and you're a better writer, you would actually edit it and then we could see what would happen? I said, all right. And the truth was, I had learned so much. I'd learned an entirely different novel's worth of information. There's so much that you can learn from doing something from beginning to end, rather than just working the same material over and over again. And so I had learned more about story arc and shaping from finishing a whole novel. And sure enough, he had become a more pointed editor. So I went and took his advice and I thought, you know what? I need to not look at the first draft. I think if I look at the first draft, I'm going to do a shoddy job of editing. I bet I'm going to just use that prose and shift it a little bit. And what I need to do in order to actually implement what I've learned is I need to write the story that I know that happens because I've already written that novel, but I have to get rid of that prose. That's old prose. So what I would do is I would read a chunk of the novel and then I would close the book. And the next day I would come back and I would write those chapters again. And lo and behold, you're thinking to yourself, well, you can't remember what happens in all of those. Of course not. Of course not. And if you can't remember it, it wasn't important enough to be in the novel in the first place. So instead of going and doing this where I was battling over how to work in this one line of prose, or how do I get this description in there, or, oh gosh, do I have to describe her mother now? No, because if I don't remember it, I'm doing it completely from scratch. So I did 3 chapters like this and I sent it to him because it was so different. And I said, like this, and he said, don't do anything else. I'm taking it to acquisitions, and they bought it just like that. Later, I learned it was because he was afraid I would finish the whole thing and then take it to big publishers instead. But regardless, it was an amazing lesson in just, first of all, how to revise, and then also in that leap of faith. I remember years later, I came to Andrew. He's still my first editor, and I love him dearly. I'm now on to larger publishers, and he also has moved on to Random House. And I said, Andrew, I was just this young thing, and I had written this first terrible draft, and then I had written you 3 chapters that were civilized. How did you possibly know that I could write the rest of the book based upon those 3 chapters? And he said, I knew that it didn't actually matter what any of the chapters looked like that came next, because you hadn't taught me that you learned how to write. You taught me that you learned how to edit. And he said, I don't buy authors now at Random House that know how to write. I buy authors who know how to edit. And that is basically a lesson that I have been trying to pass on to every single editor or agent, oh my gosh, author that I've ever met, because I hear it again and again through the industry that the real power is resilience. When you hear that, no, we don't want it, we want to see your next one. So many authors land on no without hearing we want to hear the next one, which is actually the good thing to hear. And then learning this concept of versions and translation, because it does not matter how well you write, the version of the novel that you write, the version of the article that you write, the paper you write, is never going to be the right version, because the right version exists in your head, in that abstract thought, right? Everything that comes out of your mouth is your voice, is your words. Everything that you type is a translation. So to write a translation means that it's always going to be imperfect. It's always a compromise. So editing becomes crucial, because you need to be able to feel resilient so that when you write that first draft that's an imperfect translation, that it doesn't hurt your soul. It doesn't even touch your soul to have to go through and edit it. Nothing is precious, because you still have the precious bit on your hard drive. So that's my publication story. And after that, it became more convoluted because I got an agent and everything after that. But figure this is the part where I'll ask you guys if you have questions before I just ramble on, because I've already used so much time already. And I think you can type them into you. And I also have some that you've sent to me too. So let me know if I should be answering those instead.
Exactly. Well, we can let people put some in the chat, but if you want to start, oh, look, here we go. Jim says, this is amazing so far. Great rambling.
Thank you.
I'll just start with the second question on the list that I sent you, which is just if you could describe your writing process generally. Students are usually interested in that. Like, yeah, how do you work with that translation, right, from the idea to the book?
Absolutely. So I said I wrote fiction and nonfiction, and I used to think that I wrote them completely differently. And I've discovered now that I actually, across all of my creative media, basically have the same sort of process. And if any of you are folks who are also musicians or also artists, I recommend, if there is a media that you feel really confident in your process, that you really love your process, ask yourself if there is a way that you can apply that to your writing, because that was really groundbreaking for me. So my big process that I do when I'm writing a novel is that I need to know the end. I have to know the goal. I have to know not the final climactic scene, because I'm not a plotter, but I need to know what the intention is of the piece that I am creating. Sometimes that's an actual plot moment. Like I'll know that if I'm writing the Scorpio races, that I know that my book will end when I'm at my climactic race. It's done. Because then I know what I'm building to. Sometimes though, I'll know an emotional moment because I'm writing for someone else. For instance, with the Shiver series, I knew that I was writing a novel that would make people cry. I had just a few years before read The Time Traveler's Wife, and I'm not a crier at books or movies. And yet I was reading this novel for the second time because I hated it the first time. And I wanted to know why I hated it. Because normally if you don't like a book, I put it down and I just don't think about it. But this one, I actively hated it. So I wanted to know why I hated it. So I was reading it again. And the second time through, not only did I not hate it, but I cried at the end of it. And I was so betrayed and horrified that I, of all people, should be ruining my face in public over this book, that I thought to myself, I'm going to do this to someone else. It's a vicious cycle of abuse, obviously. Anyway, so years later, as I was putting together the concept of a book, I knew only, before I knew anything else about this novel, my next novel is going to be to make people cry. And the reason why it's so useful for me to know the ending, the goal of the thing, is because a novel is a series of decisions. And the more decisions you make, or the more decisions that are made for you or taken away, the closer you are to the ending. And I don't know how many of you have actually finished a novel or a big project and you've experienced that burst of speed at the end of it. For me, it's because I've made all of the decisions that I can make and now I'm just executing them. So the more decisions, the bigger decisions I can make at the beginning, the better it is for me. So for me, I must know what that ending goal is before I start, because I know that otherwise I'll never get there. And then I can see every other input kind of through that lens. So if you imagine this concept of Shiver, which was the book I wrote because I wanted to make people cry, it would mean that every bit of inspiration that comes along to me after that is seen through that lens. So I'll say, all right, my first novel that was published was a fairy tale. So I was kind of keeping an eye out for short story competitions that were about folk tales and mythology, any kind of fairy tale, magic, supernatural things that would sort of get my name out there. And at this time, there was a 5,000 word short story competition for werewolf fiction. Now, I am not a werewolf fan. They've never been one of my favorite metaphors. I only like magic insofar as I like that it creates a heightened kind of palette for you to use for everyday things. And werewolf metaphors to me all felt like they were quite played out. So I thought, but I could do werewolves for 5,000 words, surely. And the answer was no, I could not do anything with werewolves for 5,000 words. But as my subconscious was mulling it over, I started thinking about it in light of that idea of making people cry. So could I come up with a novel that was bittersweet, that would end with people crying? What would that look like? And so that allowed me to take that concept of the magic, the rules, the thing, werewolf, which is usually the thing that readers will think that your book is about, and the thing which is actually important to me, which is the way it feels, crying. And a lot of times it won't be a feeling, it'll be a theme or something that I want to cover. If I want to talk about the battle between conservatism and, traditionalism and innovation, that's the thing that the book is about for me, but the readers will think it's a book about a horse race. So starting to stick these things together and thinking about all new inputs through the lens of this decision already made, crying, means that I can reduce all of the novels that it's not going to be. So if I know it's going to be a novel about people crying, it reduces all of these kind of bombastic decisions that I might make about what the werewolves might look like. If I want it to be this subtle, tender, bittersweet sort of thing, then I made the decision to, instead of making them werewolves, I decided that instead I would make them into wolves when they were turned into wolves, just completely natural wolves. And I would make it so that the conceit of the magic was simple. All that was magical about it was that people, after they had been exposed, would turn into wolves when the temperature dropped, and they just became humans less and less every single year. Because that was a metaphor that then started to let me talk about gradual loss in all kinds of ways. And I knew that that was the kind of metaphor that if you strip away all of the hokey werewolfness of it, that was a connection to the natural world and loss that would immediately plug into people's subconscious feelings of losing someone to cancer or addiction. I could start talking about all kinds of real things just by making those decisions. And as soon as I made that first decision, crying, stuck wolves onto it because magic, then when I knew that I wanted to make them natural wolves instead of werewolves, then it also made a decision for me because there are only a few places in the world where there are people and wolves coexisting. So I could then say, all right, it's going to take place in Minnesota. And I also knew, again, because I wanted it to be intimate, sad, bittersweet, that I'm shrinking the story down as small as possible. So it became set in a very, very intimate town in Minnesota, and it became basically about 4 characters. One character was winter in Minnesota. I picked the coldest possible place that had wolves, a real population. One of them was the wolves just as a group, the entity, longing for both that loss, but also fearing that loss. And then the 2 people who were in love, the person who was leaving and the person who has to stay. And that became the story. When you have that kind of structure, for me, that's when I can actually begin to write. This is also when I begin to totally trash my words. I used to think that this was a process that I could get around, but I know myself now. And instead of calling it starting the novel, then what I call it is something like scratch paper. So I know that I will write 10,000, 15,000 words that I will think every single time, every time. And you heard that I've written 15 novels. And this happens not just with my novels, but with my novellas, with my short stories, with my features. I always start and I tell myself, no, this time I've done enough prep work that I understand I'm going to keep these words. It's going to be great. I don't. I have a file that's called outtakes, and that is where I get to put that first 10,000 or 15,000 words after I get slower and slower and slower and realize, oh, no, I did it again. It's just scratch paper. It's the game I have to play with myself where I try out all of the different voices. I don't know if I want third person, first person, omniscient. I don't know if I want to bring in other points of view. I don't know if I'm seeing enough, if I am making the characters too one note. It's just my way of, that's why I said, if any of you are artists or musicians, it helps to know the process there, because I was a portrait artist before I was an author. And I already know that when I'm working on a big canvas, the more elaborate the piece, the bigger the underpainting is going to be. And I'm going to mark in big shapes. And then I'm going to make them more and more complicated. And this is basically my equivalent of marking in the big shapes, but no one is ever going to see the big green and orange and whatever underpainting. That's for me only. So now, instead of trying to convince myself that one day I'll be able to start it without throwing away that 10 to 15,000 words, I always have my scratch paper. And I already, when I start my novels and I have my next one started, I will have a blank document, which is named, my draft. And at the same time, I will open another document and I'll name it the draft and say outtakes, because I know it's me giving myself permission to throw that work away and not feel frustrated about it. And the strange thing is that it feels like it should be inefficient. It seems like it should take longer to write the words and throw them away. But the truth is, we're all probably in this room amazing typists. We can create a document full of nonsense words very, very quickly. That is not the long part. The long part is conceptualizing. So if you do the work and then I take it away, and then it's the equivalent of that blind edit again. I take the chapter, now I know what happens, I close the thing, and then I write it really quickly, because I can tap away at a 2,000 word chapter in a day if I actually know what happens in it. So that's really my process. And as a published author, usually everything now is sold on spec. And so that means that usually that first draft will get completed at 60,000 to 80,000 words. I have 2 critique partners who will usually look over it and talk with me about it during the process of it. And then finally, I will send it to my editor to take a look. Now, my editor would be happy to look at it at any of those stages, but one of the things that is so important is objectivity. And I know that the more times I send it to my editor for him to look at it, the less he's going to be that reader on the chair, because the reader's going to see it for the first time. They're not going to know all the things that you've gone through. You need someone who is as objective as possible. So I have my critique partners that I trust very deeply to be the first readers. He's the next reader. I'll usually get a round of big picture edits from them. So that's things like this pacing's not working, you have too many villains, or this character's unsympathetic, I don't understand this person's motivations. And I'll have a month, 2 months to turn them around. We'll go to line edits or line edits after that. So that's everything that in a book can be fixed at a line edit. And honestly, I do loads of work at the line edits. Once you really are working at figurative language, you can change the entire meaning of a scene just by changing the sentence, the beginning and the end of it, because the events can mean so many different things. So you could be talking about a child that's being pushed on a swing, and that's just a factual story, but it can be a scene of heartbreak, depending on if you tweak the language. It can be a scene of joy. It can be a horror scene. And that's at the line level, which is an incredible amount of power. I love and hate line edits because books are made and lost in line edits. And I usually have another month or 2 on those. After that's copy edits, dreaded copy edits, which is when they find out that you've written 2 Tuesdays in a row, or they fixed grammar, or they find out that you have made it 78 degrees in Minnesota in March and it's never 78 degrees, so you need to remark on it. And then finally, there's page proofs, which is when it's set for printing, and that's going through and finding out that you've inevitably done typos, and there'll always be the finished book. You always open it up and you're like, oh, it's so beautiful. I love it so much. And you will open it up and the first page that you see will always have a typo on it. That's always the rule. But that's the process of writing fiction for me. And I have to say, it's pretty much the same for my nonfiction and for fiction of any length, to tell you the truth. Even when I'm writing a feature article for Road and Track and I think, oh, well, there's only one version of events. It's totally untrue, of course, because then you're framing it differently for the readers. You're going through and always end up checking it out and starting it all over again. And for me, it just means embracing that, checking it out. And do I think that all of you guys will check out your writing? Probably not, but you will have some form of translation that once you do it more than once, you'll say, oh, this isn't a thing I can work around. This is a thing I need to learn to embrace. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's great. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions in the chat. So this one's from Eli, and Eli says that they want to start by saying, thank you for writing a complicated LGBT character. Ronan was the first representation I got that felt real, and it means so much to me. So the question is, what do publishers look for in those first few chapters? What makes writing good enough to catch the editor's eye?
I actually love this answer because I was on a call earlier today with a graphic novel editor, and he made a joke about editors and people, editors versus people. And my agent said, wait, are you saying that editors aren't people? And he said, many of my authors would say so. And it's true. If you imagine an editor as that person who's just read everything, other than that, they are literally just you. They're a reader. So if you imagine, if you walk into Barnes and Noble, and this is an exercise that I love to do actually, I'll go into the fiction section, and if I have an hour or two, I sit myself down in the stacks and I read through in order. You can do it in a library too, but you have to, if you're in a library, you have to make sure you skip authors. It's more likely for a library to have a big chunk of one author's work, and usually bookstore space is a bit more at a premium, so you're less likely to find yourself in a sudden chunk unless you get into the Stephen King section. And what I do is I just pick out a big stack of 15 books and I read the first 3 pages of all of them. And it's a learning experience because, first of all, what do I want to buy? I've read everything. That's what it feels like when I go to the store in these moods. And I'm also a very picky reader. I'm looking for something that feels like I haven't seen it before, but I'm looking for something that's accomplished. I'm looking for something that's specific. I want to feel like I'm not being told a cliche, but more than that, I want to feel grounded in an experience that I haven't had before. And that can be the voice, that can be the character, that can be me being asked to sympathize with a character that I wouldn't think was sympathetic. And if you think about the big books or the big television shows, often the hook is something that's like that. If you think about, I don't know, Dexter, for instance, or Hannibal, both of their conceits are actually the same, where it's you being asked to sympathize with a character who is not normally sympathetic. And that is enough to make it feel specific, to make you go on. But that exercise of going and looking at the first 3 pages will teach you that there's actually not a list of things that you can cross off. In writing books, it will often say, start with a bang, or it will say, never start with a dream, or looking at a mirror. And those are completely inappropriate rules. If you look at them, you realize, oh, I'm caught by this book because simply of the voice. There's something about the voice. This is the person that I want to know more about, but I can't put my finger on it. Or you'll say, oh, wow, this book is set in Alaska in a time period that I didn't know anything about, and I feel like I'm really there. Another one, you'll say, oh, this is an interesting plot conceit because this person is locked in a trunk, and I want to know why they're locked in a trunk because they're being funny about it. Why would they be funny about being locked in a trunk? And so you're looking for something surprising and specific, but you're also looking for something that's surprising and specific for you, because one of the things that I think is most important to remember about writing commercially for other people is that you're writing stories that you love for other people. So you can't give yourself up for other people. You aren't trying to write to please those editors. You're trying to please editors with the stories you want to write. And that is a very different thing. An example of this is that The Scorpio Races is my novel about a retelling of an old, it's a very small folktale. It's just a stub. It's water horses that come out of the ocean every November in Scotland, this was the legend, and would gallop up and down the beach. And if you caught them, they would be the fastest horse you ever got. But if they caught you, they would drag you into the ocean and eat you. And later just your lungs and your liver would wash up. So I retold this story. I'd always been fascinated by it. I had horses when I was a kid, and I always loved that horses are both beautiful and dangerous. And trying to explain the allure of them to people meant that a story like that, where you gave the horses an added component of magic, that's the way I love to use magic, to make things bigger, to make people understand the feelings of a situation so it becomes more universal. So the idea of being attracted to the sport of horse racing, even though it was dangerous, if you make them magical and almost spiritual in their magic, then even people who don't get horses feel about those horses the way that you do. So interestingly, that story, that novel, I get approached all the time by horse people who say, this is the best book about horses I've ever read. And I said, you do know they eat people? And they said, yes, but it feels truer than any of the other horse ones, where they're just dogs or whatever. And the thing about that book, the reason why I bring it up now is because that is a book that I wanted to write, but there is no editor under the sun that if you were going through pitch madness or whatever on Twitter would say, I'm looking for a book about maybe some killer horses, carnivorous horses, or even if they described that book, they would think it was a horror book, and it's not a horror book. It's actually probably the coziest of my books. And it's a story that I wanted to write, and I tried to write it when I was much, much younger. And I wrote several different versions of it. And it was only after I wrote the Shiver series, which was so simple and pared back with its werewolves, that I understood how to translate a story in my head for other people. So it wasn't about me changing that, so I was writing an easier horse story. It was about me contextualizing all of the things that I liked in that kind of crazy specific novel for other people. So when you ask the question, what do editors want in the first pages? Like I said, go to your Barnes and Noble, your Books A Million, your Indie, whatever. Go to the section where you buy books, where you want your books to be found, because that's important and not always the same thing as where you buy books. Sit there, pull out books and read them, and pay attention to two things. Pay attention, first of all, to the ones that you love, and also pay attention to the ones that you absolutely put back. Why do you put them back so fast? What about them, especially by the time you're fake editor, right? You're on book number 16 reading sample change. You're like, oh my, no. What made you feel like that? And then don't do that. But buy the other ones and see what they have in common. That's really my advice. And it gets me going every time. And I have to say, this is my shelf of favorites over here. Many of them. It goes and goes and goes. And still, like I said, I'm 15 books in. And when I'm stuck and I can't remember what I love about words, I'll go over there and I'll just read 12 of them in the middle of the book and say, oh, right, that's what words can do.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to sort of roll two questions into one just because of time. And I think the first one, I think you started to answer a little bit when you were talking about your process. So this is from Jim, and it's, can you discuss your best advice about raising the most emotional content in the work? And so I sort of heard you talking about, how you're thinking about that end goal and then raising the stakes along that line. And if you want to say any more directly to that. And then the second question is just, how much research do you do?
Okay. So the first one of the things that I think I've learned most importantly about putting emotion into books is setting yourself up for success before you need the emotion. So there's two different ways to do that. I don't know if you are talking about writing magic, but if it's about magic, first of all, follow the lightning strike rule. If you strike a character with lightning in book, the reader immediately understands what happens, even though it is very complicated what happens in the lightning strike. You have to learn all of these rules about electricity and what happens to the human body when it is applied to it in order to understand that. But because we have been told forever what happens when we're hit by lightning, if you strike a character with lightning, immediately we go, oh, that's bad. If you're doing anything with magic or anything emotionally that you have not proven the rules first, do not teach them how lightning works in the scene when you strike them with lightning. You need to have set back, way back at the beginning, where you go and say, this is electricity. Then maybe even in the prologue, you could have someone hit by lightning, possibly. They don't know how it works, but they died. And so you have to explain the rules of either the magic or the emotional impact of the thing before you need it. And the truth is, can you always do this in a first draft? No, sometimes you get there, you realize, oh, it would be really fun to strike someone with lightning, metaphorically, in this chapter, and you just write the chapter. That is fine, but it's your job then, when you go back to editing, to go back and prove the rule of lightning before you get there. Now, to that effect, emotionally, when I talk about building that in, a good example of this is the character Ronan Lynch that was mentioned earlier. So Ronan Lynch is a character that I knew I wanted to break in a very specific way. When I built him, I made him someone that did not show feelings on the outside. The only way that you saw him being anything other than gruff and surly and a typical kind of shaved head teenager was that he had a baby raven that he found that he was kind to. And so this was shorthand, so you proved that he was worthy. Like in the back of your head, that shorthand allowed the reader, you didn't out and out say, this is a bad boy with a heart of gold. Instead, you were putting down your proof of the lightning strike, right? You were making him gruff, emotionally inaccessible, and you were not flinching in any way. Any situation where he was being faced with another person, you made him difficult, and that never changed. So instead, what you did was you proved that little rule by giving him a baby raven that he was fond of, and you thought, well, that doesn't match, but now you know it's possible. And by setting him up like that, this groundwork basically promises that you're dragging the tension as tight as possible for the moment when he does actually show that amount of care or feeling to an actual human being. So that kind of groundwork is what I'm talking about for the emotion, where as a younger writer, I might have rushed that process, or I might have not trusted, and I might have proven it more quickly. As an adult, instead, I knew that the act of being kind to an unnamed raven at the time was sufficient for us to know that it's possible, and that I could be as cruel as I wanted to be, and we would be waiting for him to break. And then that moment would be so satisfying. So knowing that that emotional moment is going to have the power of a plot moment meant that as a more mature writer, I could also place that moment like an atom bomb too within the plot, right? Because I don't want to do it too quickly. It needs to be dragging that tension out as much as possible. So when you're in the middle of that dreaded second act and I need to propel us into the climax, when is that kind of character moment going to happen? And how will it drive me into that actual plot act? Because we read events, but we read it because we want to know why people are experiencing or how they're experiencing them. So learning how to set up those tracks for the reader to pull the emotional strings tight, that is really what you're looking for, is foreshadowing. Prove the lightning strike, even if that lightning strike is emotional. What was the second question? I completely forgot it.
It was, how much research do you do?
I would do research all day long, up and down and back and forth. I try and limit it as much as possible. What I like to do is, I used to write books as quickly as I got the idea. I thought that those ideas kind of dissipated if I didn't hold on to them. And I realize now that if they dissipate, that means they weren't very good ideas in the first place. Now what I do is, when I get an idea for a novel, I'll write it as a flash short story. I might never show anybody that short story, but it's like a time capsule where it includes not just the idea, but the things that I thought were interesting about the idea. It gives me the setting or the voice, or it's like a little care package for myself for later. And I let it sit. I let it sit for months, years. I know that it can be discouraging to hear that now because you guys are working on a short program. I can say months or years because I'm usually contracted for books years and years out. But usually a couple of months anyway, I want to bury it and see what happens. And what I'm doing then is I'm reading everything that I'd like to be researching for it. So instead of researching while I'm writing it, which quickly becomes researching instead of writing it, I'm developing my knowledge base, which will inform the plot decisions that I will start to select. And then I will fill in those holes during editing instead. Because usually, if I'm being kind, if I hand my manuscript off to my critique partners or my editors, they'll have it for a couple of weeks. So that's another chance for me to cram in more research. But otherwise, it can be tempting to do a lot of research for a chapter that you might end up throwing out. You might, spend a load of time on Google Maps zooming down streets of Cleveland. And guess what? Turns out it used to take place in New York instead. And then what? Well, I guess you have your next trip planned to Cleveland.
Thank you so much. Are there more questions I don't have anything else in the chat. I have plenty more questions, so I'm going to throw one out, but I'm going to just give a second if someone wants to type one up. I'm curious, since you're talking about working on these sort of multiple projects and working years ahead, how do you sustain that, and how do you maintain and refresh your creative stamina?
I love this question, actually, because I have a lot of writer friends that have completely burned out during COVID, much to their surprise, because they thought that they've been longing for their entire lives to have a break from real life and all of the things that were requiring them outside the house to just sit back and write. And instead, what they found is that the wells ran completely dry and writing was a chore, and they did not write anymore. And the folks that this happened the most acutely to were the ones who had most firmly identified themselves as a writer. And I don't actually think of myself as a writer, which I know shocks many people, because I obviously have sold millions of copies, and that is my day job, and that's how I spend much of my days. But I don't write about writing, I write about life. And so in order to keep on filling the well, I need to be living life, and I need to be reading. I need to be reminding myself what words do, what stories do. And I also need to, for me, my characters are drawn from life. It's the same way that when I'm painting something, if I paint a person, a scene, I have to paint from models. I paint, even if their faces end up looking different, if they end up being completely different from that, I need to start with real life and work from there. Otherwise, it becomes a memory of the last person that I've drawn. If I draw a face, if I draw Shana's face right now, if I drew it right now, it would look like her. And then if I closed the Zoom and I said, I'm going to draw it again, it would still look sort of like her, but I'd lose a lot of the detail. The third person would look less like her. And then more importantly, weeks away, if I hadn't done anything but draw Shana and then taken a break, and someone said, draw a person, guess what? It would still look like my memory of what the last person was that I had drawn, because that was how I had last thought about sketching a face. We do that as writers as well, where we draw from real life for the first work, and then we draw from real life, another thing we didn't touch on for the next one. And then if there's not enough space of living or of processing, we keep on writing memory of the last thing that we've written. We've all read our favorite authors, 20th or 30th books, and we think, oh, it's the same thing. They're writing the same character relationship again and again. And that's the thing that I'm very conscious of guarding my heart against, because I know that I do have my preferences. I'm surrounded by family and friends, and the urge when I'm processing life, even subconsciously, is to write those shapes again and again of what it is like to be a person like me living with a person like my husband, or what it's like to be amongst my family. And so getting out in the world and doing lots of things introduces me to different ways of being a person in the world, and I think makes me a better writer, as long as I do it thoughtfully. I mean, there's no danger, I think, in doing sunflowers, doing iterations of things again and again, but I want to do it thoughtfully.
Nice, thank you. I have a question. If you use a particular app or organizational system, Scrivener, for your writing, or what?
I don't use an app, though. I have friends who love Scrivener, and God bless them. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but for me, there's something about writing something down longhand that changes it. It's so profound, actually, that I actually looked it up, and it's true that there is a difference in your brain if you write something by hand versus typing. It's not that it's better or worse, but it literally activates a different part of your mind to write by hand versus typing, no matter how wonderfully you're typing. And so I have given into this, and can we turn this without knocking everything off of here? Maybe. Oh, there we go. Maybe. All right, so all the way over there, you can see that's my file cabinet. So those suckers, I love them. They are sticky, not sticky. They're like plasticky whiteboard Post-it notes. Used to use Post-it notes, but Post-it notes felt too permanent. I felt bad every single time I had to change an idea, a chapter or whatever. And so instead I looked around, and these are ones that you can use whiteboard markers on, and they stick to anything that's smooth. They'll stick to the wall as well if it's clean. And I have 40 of them, and I use them only in certain stages. And they're a thing where I just write down scenes, because if you think about a novel, the average novel is chapters are like 2,000 to 4,000 words. I mean, there'll be wild exceptions to this. I have chapters that are 1 word. I have chapters that are 10,000 words. But generally, if you think that a novel is 40 building blocks, well, that's totally doable, right? Act 1, that's 10 blocks. Act 2, that's 10 plus 10 if you split it at the midpoint, and then climax is 10 final ones. Is that actually what my novel is going to be? No, but it's a shape I could pretend to hold in my head, because again, I'm translating, right, from the abstract to the concrete. And so I just write down, what do I think the building blocks are that need to happen in that thing? And I just move them around, because for me, I build a snowman upside down all the time. I'm always putting the big snowman part on the middle part here, and then the little part he topples over. I put the big emotional scenes too early on, or I'll make it too convoluted and I get caught in the logistics of a heist or something, when actually, no, that could be 2 sentences. I don't need to write 3 chapters explaining how they got to the museum or whatever. And that just lets me do it, and it's concrete. It's something I can feel with my hands. So I know some people can do that with Scrivener, and I know some people can do it on the run with app. But for me, there's something about just the jotting it down that it jogs my brain loose, especially in that early brainstorming stage, that typing just doesn't.
That's awesome. Everyone's going to order those things now. I want to order those. They sound awesome. And then I have Justin asks if you've written multiple short stories and then realized you had a novel. And if so, is there any caution in that method?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I really like this question too. Like I said, I develop almost all of my ideas as a short story. One of the things that was most valuable for me as an artist was, back when I was a professional artist, there was a movement going on that was called a painting a day. And the idea was to conceive of and complete an entire painting every single day, as many as possible. And I thought, man, that sounds impossible. And like your painting would have to be pretty tiny, but I'll bet you learn a lot from doing the process from beginning to end. So I did it. And somewhere out there are 450 Maggie Stiefvater pieces of art that I sold. And they were tiny. They were the size of baseball cards. And I've been a professional artist since I got out of college. And my art in those 450 days, the difference between that first piece and that last piece, it was like a completely different human. And it shouldn't have been that way. I only gave myself an hour to work on them because I had my other commissions I was doing as well. And technically, because I had to steal an hour for them, I was doing art for the same number of hours every day. And yet, because I was teaching myself the process of coming up with the idea, creating the composition, and then solving those problems again and again and again, I learned so much more. And this is relevant because when I got to become a published author, I asked my 2 critique partners, look, this was a really useful thing for me when I was an artist. What do you think about doing it as an author? And they said, we are not writing a short story every day. I said, no, that would be crazy. What do you think about one every single week? So we started a blog called The Merry Sisters of Faith, and we each had a day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Mine was Friday, and we were not allowed to edit the story. We were not allowed to pre-write during the week. We had to sit down and we had to write the whole story. It had to be between 500 words and 2,000 words, I think. And then it had to go up. That was the rule. And we wrote hundreds of short stories. And the difference between it is, well, I mean, I'm proud of my early works, but the difference is that Shiver was at the beginning of it, and the Scorpio races won the Prince honor for young adult literature at the end of it. I mean, you can see my writing change, because it wasn't that I was learning on a prose level. It was that I was learning on the level of conceiving an idea, getting faster at going through ideas and rejecting them. So it meant not that I was becoming a flashier writer, I was becoming a more sophisticated writer. You know how when you're a beginning writer, writing feels like you're holding a bunch of balloons. You have pacing, you have sympathy, you have where to put in description, and you feel like I can't hold on to all of them, so something has to go, right? So you're like, oh shoot, people can have siblings. I totally forgot to write anyone else into this novel. And the more you practice, the more balloons I could hold. So yes, I wrote loads and loads of short stories, and now I try and make myself write every idea that comes to me as a short story. I still do one every single month, and they do often turn into novels. The big thing to keep in mind is if you publish those stories, Justin, make sure that you are not giving away your rights to it. A lot of short story anthologies are very mindful of this, and they're careful to have a very open contract. But if you're in any doubt, the Authors Guild or another author friend can look at it and make sure that you can continue to use those characters later, especially if you end up, and Scorpio Races actually uses lines of prose from the short story written years before. So just make sure that they have not taken the exclusive rights of North American printing or whatever. But otherwise, yes, I highly recommend it.
That's super inspiring. Well, we're coming to our last few minutes.
I know,
already. It went so fast. And so I guess I just want to ask you, Maggie, if you have like a final thought that you want to leave us with, if you want prompting. I love the best and worst writing advice you've ever given that have been given to you. But it's up to you. You don't have to take those on.
Oh my gosh. I actually do like that though, because I would say the worst piece of writing advice that I've ever gotten is also the worst piece of writing advice that you guys have all gotten, which is write what you know. Everyone has gotten this piece of advice, and we all rankled under it or embraced it accordingly. And what I've learned is that we actually know more and less than we actually think that we have known. The things that I thought I have known are actually the things that I'm usually the weakest at. If I think, for instance, I was a competition bagpiper in college, and therefore I was a competition bagpiper in college. And therefore I think that I will be the best at writing a competition bagpiping novel, I would be wrong. Because I might be, but you might be better at it because you know not. I assume you weren't a competition bagpiper, like 3 other competition bagpipers. And the reason why writing what you know can be such a lie is because sometimes if you know something too well, you don't know enough to contextualize it for people. What does it mean to them? If I, for instance, don't know how other people think of competition bagpipers, how can I write a sophisticated piece about someone moving through the world about it? Instead, if you're coming as an outsider and applying your emotional knowledge to factual knowledge, you could take the story of competition bagpiping and instead you could contextualize that better because you know what it looks like what you need to explain about bagpiping. Now, what you do know, and what I do know is, I know what it means emotionally to be a competition bagpiper. So I know what it means to do a verified skill that takes almost all the time that you have. I used to practice 4 hours a day, and then very few people can appreciate it, but still you create friendships and a community that's based upon that shared skill. That's a very specific emotional shape. And everybody has a thing like that they know. And that is the thing that makes your writing specific and magical. And as someone who is a speculative fiction writer who writes with magic of all kinds, to me, that's the heart. And then I lay my magic on top of that. So that concept of like Shiver, where the characters turned into wolves, that is being laid upon that specific emotional experience. So if you take your specific emotional experience and change its metaphorical clothing, you will have something which, again, editors will pick that up and that will feel specific and fresh and new. So that's the best and worst piece of advice, is write what you know emotionally, but don't write what you know factually, because you probably don't know what is universal to your experience or not.
I wasn't muted. I love that. Thank you so much for joining us, Maggie. And thanks to all the students, faculty, and Lindenwood community who came out tonight to be a part of this. And there's a lot of thank yous popping up in the chat. So,
well, you're very welcome. And you guys know where to find me online. If you can spell my last name, you can find me online. So good luck with all of your writing, whatever your writing is for. And thank you guys for having me as well.
Thank you so much.
Bye, take care.
Bye.